A mother dog saves a baby raccoon, but years later, the way he repays her will make you cry. On a stormy night, a loyal dog risks everything to drag a helpless raccoon pup from a raging river. It should have ended there, an act of pure instinct, quickly forgotten. But what no one knew is that the raccoon never forgot, because years later, when danger closes in and everything the dog's family loves is on the line, the raccoon comes back, stronger, smarter, and carrying a secret no one expected. A battle between loyalty and greed explodes, with lives hanging in the balance, and in the end, one question burns. When the moment comes, can a wild animal save the very family that once saved him? Your presence here is powerful. In a world full of noise, it's the quiet gestures of compassion that truly stand out. If your heart still makes room for kindness, you're already one of us. Thunder cracked across the darkened Tennessee sky as Clara Donnelly rushed to secure the last of her farm equipment. Rain pelted her face, and her weathered hands gripped the rope tightly as she tied down a tarp over her old tractor. The wind howled through the valley, bending the trees almost sideways, while lightning illuminated the threatening clouds above. "Come on, girl!" Clara called out to Nellie, her golden retriever, who stood alertly at the barn entrance. The dog's honey-colored coat was already soaked, but she remained steadfast, watching the storm with worried eyes. Clara's heart pounded as she heard the roar of the river growing louder by the minute. Living on this land for over 20 years had taught her to respect nature's fury, especially during spring storms like this one. The river that bordered her property had flooded before, but something about tonight felt different, more dangerous. She glanced at her farmhouse, its windows glowing warmly against the darkness. It was the home she'd shared with her late husband, Thomas, and now shared with only Nellie. The thought of him made her chest tighten. He would have known exactly what to do tonight. Suddenly, Nellie's ears perked up. Before Clara could react, the golden retriever bolted from the barn, charging through the rain towards the river. "Nellie!" Clara shouted, her voice nearly lost in the storm. "Nellie, come back!" Fear gripped her as she watched her beloved dog disappear into the darkness. Without hesitation, Clara grabbed her flashlight from the barn and ran after her, her boots splashing through growing puddles. The beam of light bounced wildly as she ran, illuminating the treacherous path ahead. The river came into view, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. The usually peaceful water had transformed into a raging torrent, its banks overflowing with muddy water. Trees and debris rushed past in the current, carried by the powerful flow. "Nellie!" she screamed again, sweeping the flashlight beam across the water's surface. Her heart nearly stopped when she spotted her dog at the river's edge, preparing to jump in. "No, don't you dare!" But it was too late. Nellie launched herself into the churning water, her strong legs paddling against the current. Clara ran along the bank, keeping her light trained on the golden head bobbing in the dark water. Every muscle in her body tensed as she watched her dog battle the fierce current. "Please, God," she whispered, "please keep her safe." Nellie disappeared under the surface for a moment, and Clara felt her world stop. Then the dog emerged, swimming with determined strokes towards something dark in the water. Clara squinted through the rain, trying to make out what had caught Nellie's attention. A small, dark shape thrashed weakly in the current. As Nellie reached it, Clara finally saw what it was. A tiny raccoon, barely bigger than a kitten, fighting desperately to keep its head above water. Nellie grabbed the creature gently in her mouth and began swimming back toward shore. The current fought against her, trying to drag both animals downstream. Clara's hands shook as she watched, knowing there was nothing she could do but pray and keep the light steady to guide them back. With powerful strokes, Nellie finally reached the riverbank. Clara rushed forward, helping her dog climb out of the water. The golden retriever immediately laid down the tiny raccoon, which lay motionless on the muddy ground. "Oh, Nellie," Clara sighed, kneeling beside them. "What have you done?" The raccoon kit was barely breathing, its tiny chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. It couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, its eyes barely open. Nellie began gently licking the small creature, trying to warm it with her tongue, her maternal instincts taking over. Clara stood there, rain streaming down her face, caught in an internal struggle. She had enough problems without taking in a wild animal. The farm was struggling, and she could barely keep up with the maintenance as it was. The last thing she needed was another mouth to feed. But Nellie looked up at her with those soulful amber eyes, still cleaning the baby raccoon with tender care. Clara remembered how Nellie had been Thomas's last gift to her, a puppy meant to keep her company after he was gone. How could she deny her faithful companion this one request? "All right," she said finally, shaking her head. "But just for tonight, you hear me?" Nellie's tail wagged slightly, and she carefully picked up the raccoon kit. Together, they made their way back to the farmhouse, fighting against the wind and rain. Clara's mind was already racing, trying to remember what she knew about caring for wild animals. Inside the warm house, Clara quickly gathered old towels and a small cardboard box. She lined the box with a soft blanket and placed it near the wood stove where it was warmest. Nellie gently deposited the raccoon in the makeshift nest and immediately lay down beside the box, her wet body curled protectively around it. Clara dried Nellie with a towel, checking her for any injuries from her dangerous rescue. The dog seemed fine, though exhausted from her ordeal. The raccoon kit was starting to move more, making tiny squeaking sounds that tugged at Clara's heart, despite her determination to remain detached. "You're as bad as your master was," Clara told Nellie, scratching behind her ears. "Thomas always had to save every creature that crossed his path, too." She remembered the countless injured birds, rabbits, and even a fawn once that Thomas had nursed back to health over the years. He'd had such a gentle way with animals, always knowing exactly what they needed. The memory brought both warmth and sadness to her heart. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the farmhouse, a small miracle was unfolding. As the night wore on, Clara found herself warming to the tiny raccoon. She used an eyedropper to give it small amounts of warm water, and Nellie never left its side, continuing to clean and warm it with her body heat. "If you survive the night," Clara told the small creature, "we'll have to figure out what to do with you tomorrow, but for now, you're safe here." She watched as the raccoon kit snuggled closer to Nellie, seeking comfort and warmth. The golden retriever looked up at Clara with such contentment that she couldn't help but smile. Perhaps Thomas had known what he was doing when he brought Nellie home, not just giving Clara a companion, but someone who would remind her of the importance of compassion, even on the darkest nights. As the storm gradually began to ease, Clara settled into her armchair near the wood stove. Nellie's steady breathing and the tiny squeaks of the raccoon created a peaceful melody that contrasted sharply with the diminishing thunder outside. She found herself studying the small animal, noting its tiny masked face and delicate paws. "You're going to be trouble?" she murmured, but there was no real conviction in her voice. Already she could feel her resolve weakening. The raccoon kit's fight for survival and Nellie's desperate rescue had stirred something in her that she thought had died with Thomas, the desire to nurture, to help, to make a difference in the life of another creature. The night grew later, but Clara couldn't bring herself to go to bed. Instead, she kept watch over her unlikely charges, remembering other stormy nights when she and Thomas had done the same for injured animals. He would have loved this, she thought, watching Nellie play mother to a baby raccoon. Outside, the rain finally settled into a gentle patter, and the wind died down to a whisper. The immediate danger had passed, but Clara knew that her decision to allow Nellie to save the raccoon would have consequences she couldn't yet imagine. For now, though, she was content to let tomorrow's problems wait until tomorrow. The raccoon kit had finally fallen into a peaceful sleep, its tiny body rising and falling with each breath. Nellie, too, had dozed off, but her body remained curled protectively around the box. Clara pulled a blanket over herself and settled deeper into her chair, knowing she wouldn't be moving to her bed tonight. "Sleep well, little one," she whispered to the raccoon. "You've got quite a guardian angel in Nellie." As she drifted off to sleep herself, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this night would mark a turning point in their lives. She didn't know yet whether that would be for better or worse, but watching Nellie's devotion to the tiny creature she'd saved, Clara felt a spark of hope she hadn't experienced in a long time. The storm's fury had brought them an unexpected gift, a reminder that life, in all its forms, was precious and worth fighting for. As Clara finally succumbed to sleep, the last thing she saw was Nellie's tail gently wagging, even in sleep, as if reassuring the baby raccoon that it was safe and loved. The morning after the storm dawned clear and cool, with puddles scattered across the farmyard like broken mirrors catching the early light. Clara stood at her kitchen window, coffee cup warming her hands, watching Nellie tend to the baby raccoon. The golden retriever hadn't left the makeshift nest they'd created in a cardboard box lined with old towels, not even to eat her breakfast. "You're going to have to leave him sometime, girl," Clara said softly. But Nellie just looked up at her with those soulful amber eyes before returning to gently cleaning the tiny creature's fur. The weight of the past pressed heavily on Clara's shoulders as she opened the latest stack of bills on her kitchen table. The farm's mortgage payment loomed large among them, a constant reminder of the struggle she faced since Thomas's passing 2 years ago. Her fingers trembled slightly as she sorted through the papers, each one seeming to mock her determination to keep the farm running. "What would you do, Thomas?" she whispered to the empty kitchen. The silence that answered was familiar, but no less painful. She missed his steady presence, his quiet confidence that they could weather any storm together. Now she faced these challenges alone, and some days the burden felt impossible to bear. A soft whimper from the box drew her attention. The baby raccoon was stirring, its tiny paws reaching out blindly until they found Nellie's warm fur. Clara watched as her dog tenderly nudged the small creature closer, sheltering it against her side. The sight stirred something in her chest, a mixture of warmth and grief that made her throat tight. "You're just like him," she told Nellie, walking over to kneel beside the box. Thomas could never turn away anything that needed help either. She reached out to stroke Nellie's head, remembering how Thomas had brought the golden retriever home as a puppy just months before his final illness took hold. "His last gift to me," she murmured, "and here you are, carrying on his legacy." Throughout the day, Clara found herself drawn back to the box again and again, watching the unlikely pair. The raccoon was growing stronger by the hour, taking drops of warm milk from an eyedropper with increasing enthusiasm. Nellie's maternal instincts seemed to know exactly what the tiny creature needed, when to clean it, when to let it sleep, when to stimulate it to move. "We should really take him to a wildlife center," Clara said aloud around noon, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew she wouldn't. The way the baby raccoon clung to Nellie's fur, the gentle rumble of contentment from her dog's throat. There was something healing in watching their bond develop. As she worked through her daily chores, feeding the chickens, checking the fence line for storm damage, sorting through the vegetables in her garden that had survived the deluge, Clara's thoughts kept returning to Thomas. He would have loved this situation, would have probably been sleeping on the floor next to the box, taking notes on the raccoon's progress. The afternoon sun was slanting through the windows, when Clara finally sat down in her favorite armchair, account ledger in her lap. The numbers hadn't gotten any better with the days passing. The storm had damaged part of the barn roof, adding another expense she couldn't afford. She pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to massage away the building headache. A soft scratching sound made her look up. The baby raccoon was attempting to climb out of the box, its determination evident in every wobbly movement. Nellie watched attentively, ready to intervene if needed. Clara found herself holding her breath as the tiny creature managed to hook its claws over the edge of the box. "Well, would you look at that?" she said softly, setting aside her ledger. "You're quite the fighter, aren't you?" The raccoon's dark eyes met hers, and for a moment Clara felt an unexpected connection with the small survivor. Here was another creature fighting against the odds, refusing to give up despite the forces aligned against it. She watched as it lost its grip and tumbled back into the box, only to immediately start trying again. "I suppose we need to give you a name," Clara said, surprising herself. "We can't keep calling you the Raccoon if you're staying." Nellie's tail thumped against the floor at these words, as if she understood the significance of this moment. Clara smiled despite herself, remembering how Thomas had always claimed animals could understand far more than humans gave them credit for. "Rory," she decided after a moment's thought. "It means at king. Thomas told me that once. He loved collecting name meanings." The raccoon paused in its climbing attempts at the sound of her voice, tilting its head as if considering the name. "What do you think, Nellie? Is Rory a good name for your adopted baby?" Nellie responded by gently picking up the raccoon, Rory, and placing him back in the center of the box, away from his climbing spot. The tender care in this simple action brought tears to Clara's eyes. "I miss him so much," she whispered to Nellie, who left the box long enough to rest her head on Clara's knee. "Sometimes I don't know how I'm going to keep doing this without him." She stroked the dog's soft ears, drawing comfort from the familiar texture. "The bank keeps sending letters, and the equipment needs repairs, and every time it rains, I find new leaks in the roof." Her voice trailed off as she watched Rory snuggle into the towels, his tiny body curling into a ball. Despite her initial reluctance, she had to admit there was something special about this small creature who had fought so hard to live. Perhaps Thomas had sent him to them, in his own way, another soul in need of saving, another chance to show kindness in a world that often seemed to lack it. As the day wore on into evening, Clara found herself establishing a routine around their new house guest. She warmed milk every few hours, added fresh towels to the box when needed, and even caught herself talking to Rory as she moved around the house. The raccoon seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour, his movements more coordinated, his appetite more vigorous. That night, as Clara prepared for bed, she made a decision. Moving the box into her bedroom, she placed it near the heater where Nellie usually slept. "Just until he's stronger," she told herself, but she knew she was already past the point of being able to simply release him into the wild. Lying in bed, listening to the soft sounds of Nellie tending to Rory, Clara felt some of the day's tension begin to ease. The bills would still be there tomorrow, the farm's challenges wouldn't disappear, but somehow the presence of this tiny fighter and his devoted guardian made it all seem a little more manageable. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness, not sure if she was talking to Nellie, to Rory, or to Thomas's memory. Perhaps it was to all of them, for reminding her that even in the hardest times, life had a way of offering unexpected gifts of hope and connection. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Nellie's silhouette in the moonlight, standing guard over her adopted baby, a living testament to the power of compassion and the unexpected ways love could heal wounded hearts. "We should really take him to a wildlife center," Clara said aloud around noon. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew she wouldn't. Something about the way Nellie cared for the tiny raccoon reminded her too much of the gentle compassion Thomas had shown to every creature that crossed their path. As the days turned into weeks, the baby raccoon, whom Clara found herself calling Rory, grew stronger. His eyes opened fully, revealing bright, intelligent orbs that seemed to take in everything around him. His awkward wobbles turned into sure-footed explorations of the cardboard box, then the kitchen floor, and finally the entire farmhouse. Nellie shadowed his every move, her tail wagging whenever he tumbled or played. She'd gently pick him up by the scruff when he tried to climb the curtains, or would nudge him away from anything dangerous. Clara couldn't help but smile at the sight of the big golden retriever playing mother hen to the increasingly adventurous raccoon. "He's nothing but trouble," Clara would mutter, though there was no real anger in her voice as she cleaned up another mess. Rory had discovered the joy of splashing in water bowls, scattering the contents across her clean kitchen floor. He'd figured out how to open cabinet doors, leaving a trail of pots and pans in his wake. Yet each time she found herself getting truly frustrated, she'd catch sight of Nellie's proud, maternal expression as she watched over her adopted baby, and Clara's irritation would melt away. One morning, Clara woke to find Rory had somehow managed to open the bag of dog food and scattered kibble throughout the entire kitchen. The little rascal sat in the middle of the mess, contentedly munching away while Nellie looked on with what Clara could have sworn was an amused expression. "You're encouraging him," she told Nellie, who simply wagged her tail and nosed a piece of kibble closer to Rory. Clara sighed and got the broom, but couldn't suppress a chuckle at the raccoon's pleased chittering. As spring warmed into early summer, Rory grew more independent. His baby fuzz gave way to sleek, adult fur, complete with the distinctive masked face and ringed tail of his species. He began spending more time looking out the windows, particularly at night. His wild nature was calling to him, and Clara knew the time was coming when they would have to let him go. Nellie seemed to sense it too. She became more clingy with Rory, following him even more closely than before. When he would perch on the windowsill, staring out into the darkness, she would whine softly and press against his side, as if trying to convince him to stay. "He needs to be free," Clara told Nellie one evening, stroking her soft golden fur. "He's not meant to be a house pet, girl. He needs to live the life he was born to live." The words hurt to say, knowing how attached Nellie had become. But Clara knew it was the right thing to do. The decision was made for them one warm summer night. Clara had started leaving the kitchen window cracked open, giving Rory the choice to leave when he was ready. She woke around midnight to Nellie's soft whimpering. The dog stood at the window, her nose pressed against the screen, watching as a familiar shadow moved across the moonlit yard. Clara joined her at the window, her heart heavy as she watched Rory make his way towards the tree line. He paused at the edge of the woods, turning back to look at the house. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, and Clara heard Nellie's tail thump hopefully against the floor. But then the raccoon turned and disappeared into the darkness beneath the trees. Nellie cried softly, a sound that broke Clara's heart. She sat on the floor beside her dog, wrapping her arms around Nellie's neck. "I know, girl. I know it hurts to let go, but you gave him exactly what he needed, a chance at life, just like Thomas would have done." The following days were quiet. Nellie spent hours looking out windows and searching the yard, hoping for signs of her adopted baby. Clara would find her lying in spots where Rory used to nap, her eyes sad and questioning. It reminded Clara painfully of the days after Thomas passed, when Nellie would wait by the door, expecting him to come home. Clara did her best to keep Nellie busy. They took longer walks around the property, checking fences and tending to the small vegetable garden Thomas had loved so much. Sometimes, Working in the rich earth with Nellie by her side, Clara would catch herself looking toward the woods, wondering if Rory was out there, if he remembered the dog who had pulled him from the floodwaters and loved him as her own. Life on the farm settled into its familiar rhythm. The summer days grew longer and hotter, filled with the endless tasks that came with maintaining the land. Clara threw herself into the work, grateful for the physical activity that kept her mind off both old grief and new losses. Nellie gradually stopped searching for Rory, though she never lost the habit of pausing to study the tree line whenever they worked near the woods. Some nights, when the moon was full and the crickets were singing their summer songs, Clara would sit on her porch with Nellie's head in her lap. Together they would look out across the silvered fields towards the dark line of trees, sharing the quiet companionship of those who have loved and lost together. "You did a good thing," Clara would tell Nellie, scratching behind her ears. "Sometimes the biggest love is letting go." She wasn't sure if she was talking about Rory or Thomas or both, but the truth of it settled in her heart like a warm embrace. The memory of their unusual houseguest lived on in small ways. A tiny paw print dried in mud on the porch, scratch marks on the bottom cabinet where he'd learned to open doors, the extra dog bowl Clara couldn't bring herself to put away. Each reminder brought a bittersweet smile to Clara's face, grateful for the brief time they'd shared with the wild creature who had brought such unexpected joy to their quiet life. Nellie eventually returned to her usual cheerful self, though Clara noticed she paid special attention to any small animals they encountered on their daily rounds. Her maternal instincts, awakened by caring for Rory, seemed to extend to every creature in need. It was yet another way, Clara realized, that love changed those it touched, leaving them forever different, but somehow richer for the experience. As spring warmed into summer, Clara noticed subtle changes in Rory. The little raccoon spent more time gazing out windows, his nose twitching at the evening breeze. Though he still curled up with Nellie for afternoon naps, his wild nature was awakening. Clara knew the day would come when he'd answer the call of the forest, but she wasn't quite ready to face Nellie's inevitable heartbreak. One humid afternoon, while Clara worked in her vegetable garden, a sleek black car pulled up her dusty driveway. Her hands stilled in the soil as she recognized the vehicle. Earl Maddox's luxury sedan, as out of place on her farm as a peacock in a chicken coop. Nellie, who had been dozing in the shade while Rory explored nearby bushes, raised her head and let out a low growl. Earl Maddox stepped out, his expensive leather shoes immediately gathering dust. He was dressed like he'd just come from a business meeting in the city, his crisp suit a stark contrast to Clara's dirt-stained work clothes. A practiced smile spread across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Donnelly," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Looking lovely as ever." Clara stood slowly, wiping her hands on her jeans. "This is private property, Earl. I don't recall inviting you here." He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Now, Clara, is that any way to greet an old friend? I've got a business proposition that might interest you." He took a few steps closer, and Nellie's growl grew louder. "Control your dog!" Earl snapped, his polite facade cracking slightly. "She's just protective," Clara replied evenly. "And she's got good instincts about people." Earl's jaw tightened, but he forced his smile back in place. "I'll cut to the chase, Clara. The area's developing. That new shopping centre just 20 minutes down the road. That's just the beginning. Your little farm here, it's prime real estate." "Not for sale," Clara said firmly. "Never has been, never will be." "Come now," Earl said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. "I'm prepared to offer you 3 times what this place is worth. Be reasonable. A widow like yourself, struggling to keep up with the work, this could be your ticket to an easier life." The word widow hit Clara like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. "I said no, Earl. Thomas and I built this place together. It's not for sale at any price." Earl's pleasant mask slipped completely. "Still stubborn as ever, I see. You know, I never forgot how you embarrassed me with that hunting business, running to the game warden like some self-righteous." "You were hunting out of season and taking more than your limit," Clara cut in. "The law's the law, Earl. Doesn't matter how much money you have." "Laws?" Earl sneered. "Laws are for people who can't afford better options." He glanced around the farm, his gaze calculating. "Your fences need repair. That barn roof's seen better days. How long do you think you can hold out here alone?" Before Clara could respond, a chittering sound drew their attention. Rory had emerged from the bushes and was watching them curiously. Earl's eyes narrowed. "A raccoon? Playing with your dog?" He laughed coldly. "This gets better and better. The widow Donnelly, living like some backwoods Disney princess. You always were soft, Clara. The world doesn't reward soft people." "I think you should leave," Clara said, her voice steel-edged. Nellie had moved to stand beside her, hackles raised. Earl held up his hands in mock surrender. "I'm going. But think about my offer. Things happen to farms like this. Equipment breaks down, accidents occur, insurance rates go up. Would be a shame if you found yourself in a position where you had no choice but to sell." He turned and walked back to his car, that false smile back in place. "I'll be in touch, Clara. Change is coming, whether you like it or not." Clara watched his car disappear down the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she clenched them into fists. She wouldn't let Earl Maddox intimidate her. This land was her home, her heritage, her future. Nellie pressed against her leg, offering silent support, while Rory scampered over to investigate the unfamiliar tire tracks in the dirt. Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. She'd faced down threats before, and she'd faced down this one too. That evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, Clara couldn't shake the unease Earl's visit had left behind. She knew him well enough to know he wouldn't give up easily. He'd always been the type to hold grudges, and that hunting incident had wounded his pride deeply. Nellie lay at her feet, with Rory curled up against her side. The sight of them together brought a smile to Clara's face despite her worries. Sometimes strength came in unexpected forms, she thought, like a dog brave enough to dive into floodwaters to save a baby raccoon, like a widow stubborn enough to keep her farm running against all odds. The screen door creaked as she stood up. "Come on, you two," she called. "Time for dinner." Nellie rose immediately, but Rory lingered, looking toward the darkening woods. Clara felt a familiar tug at her heart. Soon, she knew, he'd answer that call. But for now he followed them inside, his little feet pattering across the wooden floor. That night, Clara lay awake longer than usual, Earl's threats echoing in her mind. The farm had been struggling. He wasn't wrong about that. But Thomas had poured his heart and soul into this land, and so had she. No amount of money could replace what they'd built together. Outside her window, an owl hooted, and somewhere in the distance, a fox barked. These were the night sounds of her farm, as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Let Earl Maddox make his threats. She thought, this was her home, and she'd defend it with everything she had. "Not for sale, Earl. Not now, not ever." Clara's voice was as firm as the ground beneath her feet. Earl's practiced smile vanished. His eyes turned cold and hard as river stones. "You're making a mistake, Clara. Things happen to stubborn folks who don't know what's good for them. Bad things." He glanced meaningfully at her barn, then back to her face. "Remember that hunting incident? You cost me a lot of face in this community. I haven't forgotten." Clara stood her ground, though her heart hammered in her chest. Are you threatening me, Earl? Threatening? No, just stating facts. Think carefully about my offer. He turned and walked back to his car, the dust from her driveway settling on his polished shoes. As he drove away, Clara's hands trembled slightly, but she clenched them into fists. That night, she double-checked every lock, while Nellie patrolled the perimeter of the house, her usual gentle nature replaced by watchful alertness. Clara barely slept, Earl's words echoing in her mind like thunder before a storm. The first sign of trouble came 3 days later. Clara woke to find 2 sections of fence cut clean through, her cattle wandering onto the road. It took her half the day to round them up, and another day to repair the damage. She filed a police report, but without evidence, they could only note it as vandalism. A week later, she discovered her irrigation system sabotaged, water flooding her cornfield until the tender young plants drowned in the mud. The sight of her ruined crops made her stomach clench, but she forced herself to survey every inch of damage, documenting it with her phone's camera. The attacks escalated. Someone scattered broken glass in her hayfield, where it could have killed her horses. Her mailbox was smashed. Late one night, rocks crashed through her kitchen window. Each time, she called the police, but they found no fingerprints, no witnesses, nothing to connect the incidents to Earl Maddox. Clara barely slept anymore. Dark circles formed under her eyes as she tried to stay vigilant. Nellie became her shadow, growling at every unexpected sound. Even the local insurance agent started making excuses about why he couldn't help with the mounting damages. Then came the night of the fire. Clara was in the barn at dusk, working on her old tractor. The temperature had dropped, and she wanted to finish before full dark. Nellie lay near the barn door, her head on her paws but ears alert. The familiar smells of hay, oil, and leather surrounded Clara as she tightened a bolt. The first whiff of smoke was so faint she almost missed it. Then Nellie barked, sharp, urgent, and Clara looked up to see orange flames licking up the wooden wall behind her. The fire moved impossibly fast, as though fed by something more sinister than natural causes. In seconds, thick smoke filled the air. Clara dropped her wrench and stumbled toward where she thought the door was, but the smoke stung her eyes until tears blinded her. She could hear the hungry roar of the flames, feel their heat pressing in from all sides. Her lungs burned as she tried to call for help, but only managed to inhale more smoke. She dropped to her knees, disoriented, the heat becoming unbearable. This was it, she thought. Earl had won after all. Through the smoke and confusion she heard Nellie barking, but it seemed far away, dreamlike. Suddenly she felt teeth grip her sleeve. Nellie, tugging hard, guiding her. Clara crawled forward, following the insistent pull. The smoke was so thick she couldn't see her own hands in front of her face, but Nellie wouldn't let go. Together they moved across the barn floor, Clara choking and crawling, Nellie pulling and guiding. Fresh air hit her face like a blessing. She stumbled out into the cool night air, Nellie still gripping her sleeve, and collapsed in the grass 20 feet from the barn. Behind them, flames burst through the roof, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. Clara lay there, coughing violently, tears streaming down her smoke-stained face. Nellie pressed against her side, whimpering softly. In the distance, she could hear sirens approaching, but she knew they'd be too late to save the barn. As she watched her barn burn, a cold certainty settled in her chest. This was no accident. Earl Maddox had escalated from threats to attempted murder. He'd tried to kill her, and he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. Either her land or her life. Nellie's warm tongue licked her face, and Clara hugged her savior close. "Good girl," she whispered hoarsely. "Good, brave girl." But even as she comforted her dog, fear crept through her like frost. How could she fight someone willing to burn her alive? How could she protect herself, and Nellie, from a man who would stop at nothing to destroy her? The fire department arrived, their red lights painting the night in surreal flashes. As they fought the blaze, Clara sat in the grass, Nellie pressed against her side, and faced the terrifying reality that her home had become a battlefield. Earl's message was clear: back down or burn. But as she watched the flames consume years of work and memories, something else burned inside her, a determination that blazed hotter than any fire. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't sell. Whatever came next, she would face it. She owed that much to Thomas's memory, to Nellie's courage, and to herself. But as the barn collapsed in a shower of sparks, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Earl Maddox had shown his true nature, and like any predator who'd tasted blood, he wouldn't stop hunting until he claimed his prize, or someone stopped him for good. Clara stood in her tool shed, frowning at the arrangement of her equipment. Something wasn't right. The rake she always kept propped against the wall lay flat on the workbench. Her pruning shears, normally hanging from their designated hook, sat neatly beside a coil of rope. She was certain she hadn't left them there. I must be losing my mind, she muttered, running a weathered hand through her greying auburn hair. Nellie, ever faithful at her side, gave a soft whine and nudged her hand. This wasn't the first oddity she'd noticed in recent weeks. Last Tuesday, she'd found fresh coyote tracks leading toward her chicken coop, but they suddenly vanished halfway across the yard as if the animals had simply turned tail and fled. Her feed bins remained untouched, despite clear signs of raccoons and possums in the area, animals that normally couldn't resist such easy pickings. Clara methodically reorganized her tools, placing each one back in its proper spot. The morning sun streamed through the shed's dusty window, catching countless motes dancing in the air. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching over her property. "Come on, girl," she called to Nellie. "Let's check the fence line again." As they walked the perimeter of her property, Clara's mind wandered to Earl Maddox's latest threats. The wealthy developer had been unusually quiet lately, which worried her more than his usual bullying. Earl wasn't the type to give up easily, especially not after she'd publicly exposed his illegal hunting activities years ago. Nellie suddenly stopped, her ears perking forward. Clara followed her gaze to a dense patch of undergrowth. For a moment she thought she saw movement, a flash of striped tail disappearing into the shadows. Her heart skipped a beat as a memory surfaced, a tiny, half-drowned raccoon pup, saved from certain death during that terrible storm. "Rory?" she whispered, hardly daring to hope. But the undergrowth remained still and silent. That evening, as Clara prepared for bed, she noticed Nellie sitting at attention by the kitchen window, tail wagging slowly. The dog's behavior had changed subtly over the past few weeks. She seemed more relaxed despite the ongoing threats to the farm, as if she knew something Clara didn't. Morning brought fresh mysteries. Clara discovered a fallen branch that had threatened to damage her roof had been dragged clear of the house. Nearby, she found small paw prints in the mud, too large for a house cat, too small for a dog. They led to and from the woods, creating a pattern that suggested purposeful movement rather than random animal wanderings. "I'm not crazy, am I, girl?" Clara asked Nellie as they surveyed the scene. The golden retriever's tail wagged faster, her amber eyes bright with what almost looked like recognition. Meanwhile, across town in his luxurious office, Earl Maddox was holding a meeting with 3 rough-looking men. The room reeked of cigarette smoke and barely concealed menace. "The widow's gotten too comfortable," Earl said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Time to show her what happens when she ignores a reasonable offer." His fingers drummed against his mahogany desk, a habit that emerged when he was plotting something particularly nasty. One of the men, a weather-beaten fellow with a scarred face, cleared his throat. "What exactly did you have in mind, Mr. Maddox?" Earl's thin lips curved into a cruel smile. something more. Persuasive than cut fences and damaged crops, something that'll make her understand she can't win this fight. He pulled out a manila envelope and slid it across the desk. Inside was a thick stack of $100 bills. Make it look like an accident. I don't care how you do it, just make sure she gets the message. Back at the farm, Clara was beginning to piece together a pattern she couldn't quite explain. The previous night, she'd heard a commotion in the chicken coop. By the time she'd grabbed her flashlight and rushed outside, she found a fox lying unconscious near the fence, with no visible explanation for its condition. The chickens were unharmed, clucking peacefully in their roosts as if nothing had happened. Later that same day, she discovered fresh scratches on her storage shed's door frame, not the random marks of wildlife, but deliberate gouges that had somehow prevented the lock from being tampered with. Clara ran her fingers over the marks, remembering how clever Rory had been with his little paws, how he'd figured out simple latches and hooks during his brief stay with them. Could it be? She wondered aloud. Nellie barked once, tail wagging vigorously. That night, Clara sat on her porch, watching the fireflies dance across her fields. The evening was peaceful, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, a confrontation she couldn't avoid. Earl's silence meant he was planning something big, something worse than the petty vandalism and intimidation he'd tried so far. A rustling in the nearby bushes caught her attention. Nellie, instead of barking at the disturbance, simply wagged her tail and made a soft, whining sound. Clara held her breath as she watched the shadows move. For just a moment, she caught a glimpse of familiar masked face and intelligent eyes before it melted back into the darkness. "Thank you," she whispered to the night, not entirely sure why she said it, but feeling it was right. Somewhere in the distance, a raccoon's chittering call answered her, and Clara smiled for the first time in weeks. The next morning brought more evidence of her unseen guardian. The garden gate, which had been sticking for days, moved smoothly on newly cleaned hinges. Fresh paw prints circled the entire property, accompanied by signs that potential predators had been driven away. Even the morning dew seemed to reveal a pattern of nighttime patrols. Clara found herself leaving small offerings, bits of fruit, dried corn, the occasional sweet treat, in places where she'd noticed the most activity. By morning, the food would be gone, and often she'd find something in return. A shiny button, a smooth pebble, once even a lost earring she'd been missing for months. Nellie's behavior confirmed Clara's growing suspicions. The dog would often sit at attention, staring into the woods with her tail wagging, as if greeting an old friend. Sometimes she'd bark once, softly, at seemingly nothing. But Clara would later find evidence that something had been prevented, a potential break-in, a predator near the livestock, or damage to her property. One evening, as Clara checked the security of her barn before turning in, she found fresh, muddy paw prints leading to her tool rack. The prints stopped at her heavy wrench, which had been moved to a more prominent position. Examining it closely, she noticed it had been recently used. Traces of rust and dirt showed where it had tightened loose bolts on her tractor. Bolts she hadn't even noticed were failing. "Clever boy," she murmured, touching the paw prints gently. "You remember us, don't you?" The night air carried the sound of rustling leaves and a familiar, chittering call. Clara smiled, remembering the tiny raccoon who had once curled up against Nellie's warm fur, finding safety in the most unlikely of places. Now he was returning that kindness, keeping watch over the farm that had once sheltered him. But even as Clara took comfort in these signs of protection, Earl Maddox's plans were taking shape. His men had been watching the farm, learning its rhythms, looking for vulnerabilities. They reported strange occurrences, unexplained noises, missing tools, mysterious tracks. But Earl dismissed these as irrelevant to his purpose. "I want it done tomorrow night," he told his men, pushing another envelope of cash across his desk. "Make sure she understands that this is her last warning. Next time, we won't be so gentle." The men nodded, but there was uncertainty in their eyes. They'd seen things while watching Clara's farm, shadows that moved too purposefully, small but clever acts of sabotage against their own surveillance efforts. None of them wanted to admit it, but something about that place made them uneasy. As darkness fell over the farm, Clara sat at her kitchen table, reviewing her finances. The numbers were tight, but she was managing. She wouldn't give Earl the satisfaction of breaking her, not when she had so many signs that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. Nellie lay at her feet, occasionally lifting her head to look out the window. In the distance, barely visible in the growing darkness, a small figure moved through the underbrush, alert and watchful. The night ahead would bring challenges, but Clara felt stronger knowing that loyalty, once earned, could take unexpected forms. She reached down to scratch behind Nellie's ears, remembering that stormy night when her dog's compassion had set these events in motion. "We did the right thing, didn't we, girl?" she asked softly. Nellie's tail thumped against the floor in agreement, and somewhere in the darkness outside, a familiar chittering call seemed to echo the sentiment. Clara smiled, knowing that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could return in the most extraordinary ways. As she prepared for bed, she noticed fresh paw prints on her porch, deliberate marks left to let her know she wasn't alone. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but tonight, at least, she could rest easier, knowing that her farm had more protectors than Earl Maddox could possibly imagine. That evening, the late summer air hung heavy and still as Clara made her final rounds. The setting sun painted long shadows across her land, and crickets had begun their nightly chorus. Nellie padded beside her, both of them heading toward the river to check on the irrigation pump, a ritual they'd performed countless times before. "Just a quick check, girl," Clara said, patting Nellie's head. "Then we'll head in for dinner." The river burbled peacefully, its waters reflecting the orange and purple sky. Clara knelt to examine the pump's connections, making sure everything was secure. That's when she heard the crunch of gravel under tires. Her heart sank as a black SUV rolled to a stop at the end of her access road. Earl Maddox stepped out, his expensive leather shoes inappropriate for farmland. Two burly men emerged from the vehicle behind him. "Evening, Clara," Earl called out, his voice carrying false warmth. "Lovely sunset we're having." Clara straightened slowly, keeping her eyes fixed on the approaching men. Nellie moved closer to her side, hackles rising as a low growl rumbled in her throat. "You're trespassing, Earl," Clara said firmly, though her mouth had gone dry. "Get off my property." Earl's practiced smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now, Clara, is that any way to treat a neighbor, especially one who's about to make you a very generous offer?" He pulled a folded document from his suit jacket. The two men spread out, flanking Earl as they approached. Clara recognized them from town, local muscle Earl sometimes hired for his negotiations. Her gaze darted around, looking for an escape route, but they had positioned themselves between her and the path back to the house. "I'm not interested in any offer," Clara declared, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "We've been through this." Earl's facade of friendliness cracked. "You know, Clara, I've been patient. More patient than you deserve after that stunt you pulled with the hunting incident." He took another step forward. "But patience has its limits." Nellie's growl grew louder, and one of the men produced a length of rope from his pocket. Clara's blood ran cold as she realized this wasn't just another attempt at intimidation. "You can't force me to sign anything," she said, backing up slowly. Her heel caught the river's edge. Earl's smile turned predatory. "Actually, I think you'll find that I can. You're out here all alone, Clara. No witnesses, no help coming. Just sign the papers, and we can all go home happy. Clara's mind raced. She could try to run, but they'd catch her easily. She could scream, but no one would hear over the river's sound. Nellie tensed beside her, ready to defend her owner despite being hopelessly outmatched. Just then, a sharp, chittering sound cut through the tension. Something dark and fast burst from the underbrush, launching itself at the nearest man's legs. The man yelped in surprise, stumbling backward as a full-grown raccoon, far larger than average, slashed at his shins with surprising precision. "What the hell?" Earl shouted, jumping back as the raccoon whirled toward him. Clara stared in disbelief. The raccoon moved with incredible purpose, its attacks strategic rather than wild. It darted between legs, causing the men to stumble and collide with each other as they tried to avoid its quick, sharp claws. "Rory?" Clara whispered in amazement. The raccoon paused for just a moment, looking at her with startlingly intelligent eyes, and Clara knew without doubt it was him. The tiny pup Nellie had saved from the river now returned to save them. Nellie barked excitedly, recognizing her former charge. She joined the fray, her larger size complementing Rory's swift attacks. Together, they created complete chaos among Earl and his men. "Get that thing!" Earl shouted, but Rory was too quick. He scaled one man's leg and back like a ladder, causing him to spin wildly before crashing into his companion. Both men went down hard, cursing and swatting at the air. Earl reached for something in his jacket, but Rory seemed to anticipate the movement. He launched himself directly at Earl's face, causing the developer to stumble backward with a terrified yell. The document he'd been holding flew from his hands, landing in the river and floating away on the current. "Clara, run!" a voice in her head seemed to say, though she knew it was just instinct taking over. She didn't waste the opportunity. With Nellie at her heels, she sprinted past the disoriented men, taking the shortest path back to her house. Behind her, she could hear Earl shouting obscenities, punctuated by more yelps and crashes as Rory continued his assault. The raccoon was herding them back toward their vehicle, his attacks precise and purposeful. Clara didn't slow down until she reached her porch, her chest heaving as she fumbled for her phone to call the sheriff. When she turned to look back, she saw the SUV's tail lights disappearing in a cloud of dust. Earl and his men had fled. Nellie sat at attention beside her, alert but calm now that the danger had passed. From the darkness they heard a familiar chittering sound. Rory emerged from the shadows, his masked face almost seeming to smile as he approached the porch steps. This time, he didn't disappear into the undergrowth. Instead, he sat at the bottom of the steps, regarding Clara and Nellie with what could only be described as satisfaction. His fur was sleek and healthy, his eyes bright with intelligence. He had grown from the helpless pup they'd rescued into a powerful protector. "You've been watching over us all this time, haven't you?" Clara said softly, understanding now all the strange occurrences around the farm. The tools, the coyote tracks, the untouched feed. Rory chittered again, as if confirming her suspicions. Nellie whined softly and took a step toward him, her tail wagging gently in recognition of her former charge. The night air was still charged with the energy of the confrontation, but Clara felt a profound sense of security she hadn't experienced since before her husband's death. Her unlikely guardians, a loyal dog and a clever raccoon, had proved that she wasn't as alone as Earl had thought. Rory stayed visible at the edge of the porch light, grooming himself casually as if he hadn't just fought off 3 grown men. His presence seemed to say that he had no intention of disappearing again. He had a self-appointed duty now, protecting the ones who had once protected him. Clara sank into her porch chair, her hand still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. Nellie settled at her feet, and Rory remained at his post at the bottom of the steps. Together they formed an unlikely but unshakable alliance, bound by loyalty and the memory of a stormy night when compassion overcame caution. The crickets resumed their evening song, and the river continued its eternal journey. But something fundamental had shifted on Clara's farm. Earl Maddox had sought to prove her vulnerability, but instead he had revealed her greatest strength, the bonds of loyalty that transcended species and time, forged in moments of kindness and repaid when needed most. As the dust settled and her racing heart began to slow, Clara sat heavily in her wooden porch rocker, trying to process everything that had just happened. Nellie pressed close against her legs, offering silent comfort while maintaining her watchful guard. At the bottom of the steps, Rory continued his careful grooming, acting for all the world like fighting off 3 grown men was just another evening's work. Clara's mind wandered back over the past few years, pieces falling into place like a puzzle, finally revealing its true picture. She remembered the morning she'd found all her chicken feed untouched after hearing raccoons in the night. At the time, she'd attributed it to luck, or perhaps her improved storage methods. Now she recalled the distinctive paw prints leading away from the shed, not toward it, as if something had been standing guard. "It was you," she breathed, looking at Rory with new understanding. All those times. She thought about the mysterious absence of coyotes that had plagued neighboring farms, but somehow avoided hers. The tracks she'd found in the mud told stories of confrontation. Coyote prints overlapped with smaller ones, leading away from her property. She'd assumed the predators had simply found easier pickings elsewhere. Now she knew better. "Remember that time we found the garden tools all scattered, Nellie?" Clara mused aloud. The golden retriever's ears perked up at the memory. "We thought it was vandals or maybe just the wind, but nothing was actually damaged or stolen." Rory looked up from his grooming, his intelligent eyes meeting hers. Clara could almost swear he was nodding. "You were warning us, weren't you? You'd spotted Earl's men scouting the property that night." The raccoon chittered softly, confirming her suspicion. All those unexplained incidents over the years, the strange noises that had scared away trespassers, the mysterious way her livestock remained untouched during a wave of local thefts, even the fallen branch that had blocked Earl's truck from accessing her backfield one day, they hadn't been coincidences at all. "I've had a guardian angel all this time," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Only instead of wings, you've got clever paws and a bandit's mask." Nellie whined softly and wagged her tail, as if agreeing. The dog had always seemed less surprised by strange occurrences around the farm. Perhaps she'd known all along that her adopted pup was nearby, keeping watch. Clara remembered the countless times she'd felt eyes on her while working in the fields. Not threatening eyes, but protective ones. She'd dismissed it as imagination or paranoia. Now she realized those feelings had been real. Rory had been there, watching from the shadows, repaying a long-ago kindness with years of silent protection. "All because we helped you that stormy night," Clara said, shaking her head in wonder. "Because Nellie wouldn't leave you to drown, and I couldn't say no to her big heart." Rory stood and stretched, his movements graceful and deliberate. He climbed 2 steps higher, closer than he'd ever come before, and sat down again, his presence both wild and somehow deeply familiar. His eyes held wisdom that seemed impossible for a raccoon, yet Clara had just witnessed the proof of his extraordinary intelligence and loyalty. The night air carried the scent of wet earth and growing things, reminding Clara of that long-ago storm that had brought Rory into their lives. She'd been so focused on survival then, both his and her own, that she hadn't recognized the magnitude of that simple act of mercy. One small decision, made in the rain and dark, had created ripples that would protect her farm for years to come. "I've been calling this place my husband's legacy," Clara said softly. "But it's more than that now, isn't it? It's become something new. A place where loyalty knows no bounds, where kindness given returns tenfold." Rory chittered again, a sound that seemed to carry agreement. He'd grown from that helpless pup into a fierce protector, choosing to dedicate his life to watching over those who had once watched over him. The revelation filled Clara with a warmth that pushed back against the cool evening air. The night air crackled with malice. Earl Maddox's expensive car tires crunched on the gravel as he pulled away from Clara's farmhouse, his face twisted with hatred in the rear-view mirror. The smell of gasoline lingered behind him, seeping into the wooden walls of Clara's home while she slept unknowing inside. The first flames licked up the back porch, hungry and quick. Rory, keeping his nightly vigil from a nearby oak tree, saw the orange glow begin to spread. His sharp eyes caught movement in the shadows, Earl's retreating figure, illuminated briefly by the growing blaze. Inside, Clara woke to Nellie's frantic barking. Smoke was already curling under her bedroom door, thick and choking. She stumbled from bed, the heat hitting her like a wall as she opened the door. "Nellie!" she called through the haze. "Where are you, girl?" The dog's barks turned to frightened whimpers, coming from downstairs. Clara started down, but flames had already engulfed the staircase. The fire moved with unnatural speed, fed by the accelerant Earl had used. Clara's lungs burned as she tried to find another way down. Outside, Rory watched in horror as the flames climbed higher. His keen ears picked up Nellie's distressed cries from within. Without hesitation, he darted towards the house. The heat was intense, but he found a broken window and squeezed through, dropping into the smoke-filled kitchen. The fire roared around him, but Rory's sharp senses cut through the chaos. He found Nellie trapped in the living room, separated from the door by a wall of flames. The golden retriever's fur was singed, her eyes wide with fear. Rory chittered urgently, catching her attention. He knew another way out, a small cellar door he'd discovered during his years of watching the house. Clara had managed to climb onto the porch roof, but the smoke was overwhelming. She could hear Nellie below, and her heart clenched with fear for her faithful companion. "Nellie!" she screamed again, her voice raw. Inside, Rory led Nellie through the burning house, staying low where the air was clearest. The dog followed trustingly, remembering perhaps that small pup she'd once saved from drowning. They reached the cellar steps, just as part of the ceiling collapsed behind them. The cellar door burst open from within, and Nellie emerged into the night air, coughing but alive. Rory was right behind her, his fur blackened with soot. But instead of fleeing to safety, they both turned back toward the house. Clara was still up there, trapped and running out of time. Nellie barked desperately, while Rory scrambled up a nearby trellis. He reached Clara just as the roof began to give way. His chittering urged her to follow him down the trellis. It was her only chance. Clara understood. With trembling hands, she grabbed the wooden lattice and began to climb down. The roof collapsed with a thunderous crash just seconds after her feet touched the ground. Clara stumbled away from the burning building, supported by Nellie on one side and, remarkably, Rory on the other. They watched together as her home, filled with memories of her late husband and their life together, was consumed by flames. In the distance, sirens wailed. Someone had seen the fire and called for help. But they heard another sound too, the distinctive sound of a car engine failing to start. Earl's expensive vehicle had stalled just down the road, trapping him at the scene of his crime. When the police arrived, they found him there, reeking of gasoline, the evidence of his vengeful arson undeniable. Clara hugged Nellie tight, her hands buried in the dog's smoke-scented fur. Beside them, Rory stood vigilant, his masked face illuminated by the dying flames. He had repaid his life debt twice over now, saving not only Nellie but Clara as well. The bond between them, forged in that long-ago storm, had been tested by fire and emerged unbreakable. In the days following the fire, Clara watched the last police car drive away from her property, taking with it the final pieces of evidence against Earl Maddox. The weight of years of harassment and fear lifted from her shoulders like morning mist burning away in the sunshine. Insurance would cover the rebuilding of her house, and surprisingly, several neighbors had already offered their help. The community, shocked by Earl's actions, rallied around her with support she hadn't expected. For now, she was staying in her old travel trailer, parked safely near the undamaged barn. Standing by the river where everything had begun, Clara watched Nellie and Rory sharing a peaceful moment together. The golden retriever lay in the grass, her tail gently wagging, while Rory sat nearby, occasionally dipping his paws in the cool water to soothe his healing burns. The sight brought tears to her eyes, not of sadness, but of profound gratitude. Who would have thought? She whispered to herself, remembering that stormy night when Nellie had pulled a tiny, half-drowned raccoon from these same waters. That single act of compassion had set in motion a chain of events she could never have imagined. The farm still showed the scars of Earl's malice, scorched earth where the house had stood, damaged fences that needed mending. But those were just physical wounds that time and hard work would heal. What mattered more was what remained unbroken, the bonds of loyalty that had saved them all. Rory turned his head toward her, his intelligent eyes meeting hers. He chittered softly, a sound that seemed to carry recognition and affection. Nellie's ears perked up, and she trotted over to Clara, pressing against her legs in that familiar, comforting way. Clara knelt down, embracing her dog while reaching out to gently touch Rory's offered paw. This was her family now, unconventional, unexpected, but bound together by something deeper than blood. Through fire and flood, through years of separation and moments of desperate need, they had proven that courage, sacrifice, and devotion knew no bounds. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.